As I say, the baby's in bed, so we're clear on my end. But how long are we looking to record, do you reckon?
It depends on how interesting you are. No,
2 minutes then.
generally like around 45 minutes, but like between 45 minutes and an hour. I think we could probably talk for like 3 hours if we set out to do it, but I
Yeah.
won't Joe Rogan you, don't worry. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Drew. If the data tells a story, there's one person you can count on to narrate it. Friend of the pod and chief data reporter at the Financial Times, John Burn-Murdoch, has for years been catching readers' attention with charts that highlight just how society and politics are changing. Social classes stratifying, innumeracy and illiteracy rising, birth rates dropping, gender gaps widening, American life expectancies stalling out, and much more. Lately, his work on economic and social reactions to Trump's second term have been literally jumping off the page. In a chart showing plummeting European tourism to the United States, Icelandic tourism decreased so much it got cropped off the page. The US Economic Uncertainty Index grew so much it also extended off the axis, dwarfing the Great Recession and COVID pandemic. So I could think of no one better to talk about some of the ways the data is telling the story of our evolving American and global politics in this moment than John Burn-Murdoch himself. John, welcome. I was going to say welcome back to the podcast, although this is a new podcast. So welcome to the podcast.
Galen, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I don't know what it says about my chart making skills if they seem to get broken so often.
It only emphasizes the point. But I do want to say, as I was writing that introduction, I thought to myself, damn, you cover a lot of not so optimistic trends in the data. So before we indulge any pessimism, and don't worry, we'll indulge it, is there a trend that you have your eyes on where you're like, man, that's actually pretty good. We should be optimistic about this as a society?
I mean, honestly, there are a few. Like there's a couple of things I've written about in the last few months. The fentanyl crisis starting to ease, I think, is one that a bunch of your listeners might already be aware of. But I think that's super striking. You mentioned life expectancy earlier, and opioid deaths alone were responsible for a massive chunk of America's underperformance in that. And so I think that easing is huge. Similarly, I did a sort of provocative take a while back about whether we might have seen peak obesity now that we're in the Ozempic era. So I think health-wise, there's actually some promising signs out there. And then, closer to the topics that we're talking about today, I guess, something super interesting is how a lot of the sort of medium to long-term shifts in politics that we'd seen over the last couple of years have gone into reverse recently. So I was actually working on a talk that I was giving a couple of weeks ago where I'd been showing things like, the rise of the far right, the ongoing slow sort of death of centrist moderate politics. And then thanks to Trump, we've suddenly seen a lot of those trends reverse. In a couple of recent elections, the radical right underperformed their final polls, Germany being one example. And we've also seen approval ratings for the likes of Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer in the UK increase off the back of them being seen as these sort of sensible figures relative to Trump. So yeah, even in politics, there are signs that it's maybe not all doom and gloom.
The pendulum always swings. So maybe we'll dig a little bit further into some of those trends as we go. But when it comes to this moment in data, so last week on this podcast, I talked to Republican pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson about how Americans are reacting to Trump's second term politically. Overall, his approval rating has been trending down. And when it comes to the economy specifically, he's doing even worse than he's doing overall. He's somewhere around net negative 10 percentage points on average on that issue. You've been looking at some other trends in how Americans are feeling about the economy and also how markets and businesses are reacting. What are you seeing?
Man, I mean, like you say, it's a lot of very sharp inflection points in line charts, whether those are going upwards or downwards, depending on the indicator. But yeah, I think, God, it sounds lazy to use the term unprecedented because it feels like it's been word of the year for about 5 years now. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of stuff at the moment that we just do not usually see or do not even see in extremes. You mentioned earlier on the economic uncertainty data. So it's not just that we don't usually see this, but we've never seen anything remotely like what the last couple of months have shown on that. So what we're talking about here is the extent to which uncertainty, unpredictability, terms like that are being used in news coverage or in everything that's out there. Basically, how much are people worried about not knowing what's happening? And what we've seen in the last couple of months is those levels in the US have reached pretty much twice what they reached in April 2020, when we were at the biggest thing that we'd seen in generations, the pandemic, was taking off, and there was, of course, immense uncertainty about what this would mean for the economy alongside everything else. And we're now at double that under Trump. So I think that's hugely significant. And that's true in the US, but it's also true in the other international versions of that index, the global one as well. So just a real sense that people don't know what's around the corner. And, it can be easy to look at something like that and say, well, that sounds like a fairly soft indicator. Like, what does that actually mean in reality? But uncertainty, of course, is massively, massively important for companies, for businesses that are trying to plan their next few months. It's important for investment decisions. It's important for the extent to which consumers feel confident in spending their own money. We see this in academic studies, but we also see it in the survey data where companies are asked what they're expecting their orders to be in the coming months. And again, all of these are looking like sharp upward or downward turns, again, depending on exactly what we're measuring. So yeah, I think this is just really, really striking stuff. And we can talk all we like about how shocking it is, but I think it really is still probably more unprecedented than people imagine.
Yeah, something really stuck out to me, which is that the Wall Street Journal published an article yesterday. The title was "Trump is Everywhere Except in the Economic Data." And they talk about how economic sentiment is turning for the worse, that in polls, people are dissatisfied. In headlines, we see a lot about a crackdown on immigration. But then when you actually look at things like hiring, the unemployment rate, inflation, GDP, even when you look at numbers of foreign workers in the United States, it doesn't actually look like all that much is changing, if anything. Another thing they point to is federal spending. There's been a lot made about DOGE cuts. Federal spending is actually up this year. And so if you just looked at the headlines, you would think that the economic reality in the United States had fundamentally flipped. But the core data doesn't really seem to have changed much. So is this all emotion, or is there something underneath it all? And maybe will all of this emotion change the bedrock?
Fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things I've found when I'm looking at these charts is a lot of them are measuring exactly that sentiment. It's how are people feeling rather than what's actually changing. And I think certainly thus far, per that journal piece, that has been a valid distinction to make. But there are pretty solid signs, I think, now that distinction is starting to break down. So I saw something just earlier today, actually, about some US auto companies starting to announce layoffs coming up because of people having less confidence to buy vehicles. That there's now been enough time for this sense of uncertainty to bleed through into actual consumption patterns. And we're talking thus far, we're talking 3-digit numbers of job losses, but that's in those are a couple of firms in one state. You can easily see how that could get significantly larger. So I think that impact of reduced consumer confidence is something that's going to start showing up. The other one, and this is a piece you mentioned already that I worked on myself with some colleagues, was looking at tourism. And we're seeing really quite significant drops there in people coming to the US from other countries, particularly the case for Canada, Western Europe, and parts of Central America. Again, not enormously surprising when you consider the experiences that some tourists have been having with US border control. But it's also, I think, that for me is a really nice concrete indicator of sentiment. YouGov put out some data about 2-3 months ago now. It was back in February, showing the extent to which people in Western Europe had favourable views of the US. And it showed these massive declines in the shares of people saying they had a favourable opinion of the US. Denmark again, funnily enough, had one of the steepest declines, unsurprisingly, when you consider what Trump has said to Greenland. And again, you could have looked at that in February and said, well, that's just people ticking a box on a survey. But 2 months later, you look at the border control data, and these have translated into very significant declines in the number of tourists, again, particularly Denmark. So I think that's just what we're seeing here is there was going to be a couple of months lag between people feeling strongly a certain way and then that translating into spending decisions.
So revealed preferences starting to align with those stated preferences in the data. We'll get back to the economic sentiment stuff in a second, but I do want to ask because, tension between the US and Europe, while still remaining friends, is nothing new. For my part, I grew up in the era of calling French fries freedom fries because the French wouldn't invade Iraq with us. I also spent years during high school and college living in both Italy and Turkey. And so I'm pretty personally familiar with the anti-American sentiment, particularly on the left, that has existed on the continent for a very long time. How different is this moment, if different at all? And I'm sure, obviously, being based in the UK, you may have anecdotal experiences, but also sort of based on the data.
Yeah, look, I think this goes both ways. So that YouGov data I mentioned earlier, the views of the US, they're not a million miles away right now from where they were under Trump's first term. So some of this is just, people in Europe don't like Donald Trump, most people that is, and he's back in power. So people don't like people are souring on the US again. But I think there's a couple of things. One is that data where it was similar to Trump's first term, that was 3 months ago. Now, I suspect those figures will now be significantly lower than they were then. And indeed, for some countries like Denmark, they already were. So I think the intensity this time is that much stronger. Now, again, I think some of the key differences here are how this is just much more concrete. So we've passed from the realms of anecdote to data in terms of tourists' literal experiences crossing the border. There was another story I saw recently about a couple of German tourists landing in Hawaii. They hadn't booked a hotel and they were detained and then deported. So this has stopped now just being people saying orange man bad, and it's now orange man bad and I don't want to be thrown in handcuffs. So yeah, I think that is one example of this just becoming much more concrete. And again, just people seeing what Trump is doing, the real magnitude, the stark differences between this term and the first term, where he was largely sort of buffered by the people around him. It's become much more concrete, the impact on stock markets and so on. I mean, you mentioned my perspective here in the UK. We, of course, had something slightly similar during the blink and you miss it tenure of Liz Truss.
49 days, baby.
Indeed.
Almost beat that cabbage, but not quite.
Not quite. Lettuce, I'll have you know.
Lettuce, okay.
Details. But yeah, so we've seen this sort of thing in the UK in terms of the impact on the financial markets. And again, how very, very, very real that is. That can have significant impacts on people's pensions, investments, not to mention the wider economy. So I think that the whole thing this time around just feels much more concrete. So it is, you're right, this is still sentiment, this is still vibes. It's easy to have strong opinions without acting on them. But I think this time so much more is actually happening in the real world that people's reactions are also that much more real.
Okay. Will you allow me to stir the pot for just 1 second?
Of course.
So when I go to Europe or talk to European friends, I encounter a lot of people who like to shit on Trump. You encounter a lot of that in the US too, but in Europe, it's more of this sense of bafflement. Like, how could this even happen? And my somewhat pot-stirring response in these cases is to say that I kind of think in some ways Trump is America's first European president, which is to say that he's aligned American political debates with the kind of national identity and nostalgia-driven debates that have played out for decades in Europe, right? I mean, debates in France over the role of culture and heritage, debates in Italy, whether being a pluralistic society should even be a goal or whether it's even possible. Obviously, Brexit happened before Trump was ever elected, not to mention the fact that Europe, Spain and Portugal, had dictatorships well into the modern post-war era. And so I'm curious if Europe should be as baffled as they are. In some ways, it seems like America has taken a turn more towards European-style politics with Trump's political movement.
Very, very interesting. Excellent pot stirring. Yeah, look, I think in terms of rhetoric, there's certainly an extent to which that's true. The sort of punchy nationalist populist thing is very, very real, very, very real in Europe. I think a couple of bits where I would stir the pot back at you.
I mean, it's only fair.
Who knows what we'll cook up at the end of this. One is that, again, that pivot from rhetoric to action. I think, again, Trump's first term, there were elements of that where it really was, he's saying similar things to the likes of the radical right in countries like France, or even not the radical right, even often more moderate politicians. But now, the deportations, the action on things like tariffs, those are things we just haven't seen from governments in Europe. So I guess the point I'm conceding here...
Wait, wasn't the conservative British government paying immigrants to go to Rwanda?
This is again one where I would say the British government was talking about doing this, and it eventually got to the point where they were sort of trying to do it, but they were still coming up against the law, and were not just sort of riding roughshod over the law in the way that Trump has been. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the sort of offshore processing thing, the British government talked about that. Denmark, as is the case on a lot of immigration things, had actually been doing similar things for quite some time. So if we look at some specifics, there certainly are parallels. But I think the biggest difference between Trump and Europe then is his approach to international collaboration, cooperation, that kind of thing. So Europe, of course, is the EU is itself, it is all about international collaboration. It's about the sense that the countries should work together, that we'll achieve better things if we do. Trump, of course, has demonstrated now many, many, many times that he's completely opposed to that. So I think that's one of the biggest differences. The other thing I would say is that, apart from a couple of particular examples, the similarities that you're right to point out between Trump and certain European styles have generally been with more fringe parties. So what it feels like is happening here is that nationalist populism, which absolutely exists in Europe, but has by and large remained outside of government, is what we're now seeing in government in the US. So it's not that you couldn't find dozens and dozens of prominent politicians in Europe who agree with Trump on a lot of things. It's that they are usually speaking to about 20% of their electorate, often even less than that. And therefore, these views exist, but they're to the fringe. And they, in the US, this was probably the case. These views were fringe for quite some time. It's just that now they've found a way to power through Trump. And so, I think the exact rhetoric, policies, they're not entirely unique, but the full package of them being in one place, in one person, in one party, and now one government. And again, the shift from rhetoric to action, I think, is where I would say the difference is.
Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. I think you started to hint at this already in the rising popularity of Macron and Starmer. But how is this all affecting European politics? Is the thermostatic public opinion of Europe mean that globalization, globalism, left-wing politics, collaboration, whatnot are all popular again?
It does vary. In the first, I think, particularly after Trump's actions on Ukraine, the Oval Office sort of dressing down of Zelensky, the actual responses of a lot of European leaders to that, I think, helped them. So you had people like Macron and Starmer being these really sort of sensible, strong voices for reason and rationality. You had increasing conversations about closer collaboration, both within the EU and between the UK and the EU. And there was this sense of sort of rallying around the moderate cause in Europe in response to what we'd seen from Trump and Vance. So I think there was something quite particular there. And that is maybe now wearing off a bit. So in the UK, for example, Keir Starmer did see that initial improvement in his popularity, but that has essentially flattened out now. Domestic politics has re-exerted its primacy. And I think we're seeing differing extents of that in different countries as well. I don't think any sort of centrist, moderate governments and leaders in Europe at the moment are being harmed by what Trump is doing. But I think maybe that initial sort of Trump bump is starting to wear off, and we're now seeing what's actually happening in each country reassert itself.
Well, what we're seeing in the United States that you've pointed out in your work is that after, basic agreement amongst Republicans and Democrats on the issue of trade, we are now seeing a massive split. Can you put some numbers to that?
Yeah. So what we've got here is there's some super interesting polling being done by an organization called the Polarization Research Lab. And they're running this weekly poll of thousands of Americans called America's Political Pulse. Now, I love this because, as you and I know, public domain, detailed respondent level polling data is pretty rare to come by. But this has now been out there for almost the last 2 years. And so the ability to drill down and see, instead of just one line, what's happening in different groups is awesome. And yeah, one of the questions they've been asking for a couple of years now is people's views on free trade, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, somewhere in between. And yeah, for quite a long time, pretty much up until election day last year, about 1 in 5 Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, had very strong approval of free trade. Now, the numbers who strongly disapprove were smaller. So to be clear, Americans were still at that point relatively supportive of free trade, but it was a sort of lukewarm support. Whereas starting around the election date and really widening significantly after Trump's inauguration and, of course, the tariffs, we've seen this massive gap opening up. So conservatives have, if anything, got slightly more disapproving on free trade, whereas liberals, Democrats, and indeed, as you say, moderates and independents have all shifted in the opposite direction. So you've gone from about 20% of people who identify as liberal saying free trade is good to now well over 40%. And that gap is just widening week by week as well.
We saw almost the exact same thing happen on immigration during Trump's first term, which is to say that for much of the sort of 90s and 2000s, Republicans and Democrats agreed on immigration, were relatively skeptical of large-scale immigration. But then as the Tea Party came to the fore, and then especially once Trump won, you see Democrats, and to some extent independents as well, become a lot more favorable towards immigration and more liberal immigration policies. Now, that was basically a sort of response to Trump. That also got Democrats in a pretty precarious situation electorally, because they ended up taking a lot of positions that were not broadly popular with the American public. It was this sort of, we're just going to take the exact 180 position, or at least be most vocal on the exact 180 position to whatever Trump is doing, right? So, he wants to build a wall. We want to decriminalize crossing the border and abolish ICE. And then, of course, during Biden's administration, you saw the most liberal immigration policies maybe the country has seen in the modern era, with record numbers of encounters at the southern border that then Americans reacted against very, very negatively. We've talked about this before on the podcast. In this moment, do you see the debate over trade playing out similarly, where Democrats now fall in love with free trade and that puts them in another precarious situation, or is this a totally different thing?
I think this one is quite different, partly because I think there are, feelings around immigration are just so much more heated. It's always been a much more salient issue, especially as you say in recent years. So I think one part of it is just that people just feel much more strongly about the topic. The other is that I think to the extent that hard data can speak to either of them, the impact that Americans are likely to feel from tariffs over the coming months, if they go into effect as they've been advertised, which of course is no certainty, will be palpable and will be negative. This is one where I think they're almost opposite in that regard. I think if you have a sort of open borders vibe and you then get relatively open borders in terms of what we've been saying about the southern US border, that has manifested itself in people thinking about this as being sort of uncontrolled. They on some level just don't like that. They shift in the other direction. I think with free trade, globalization, we'll almost see the opposite, which is Trump is now he's essentially the Biden here, opening the borders, in this case, imposing high tariffs. People will start to feel that. And if anything, it will move that line further in the direction towards support than it has been. And you may even start to see the sort of non-MAGA Republicans also become more supportive of free trade.
I think you noted this, actually, that there's a segment of the Republican Party that Trump is starting to lose on the issue of the economy and trade in particular.
Yeah, so this was, again, I'm trying not to be a paid shill for YouGov here, but they do have lots of great data. So
Don't worry, I've done the same.
Excellent. I think it was actually, I don't know whether he counts as a friend of the podcast, but Carl Bialik, who used to be
former 538er. Yeah,
indeed.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I asked Carl for this, and he was able to pull it together. So, if you ask the people who voted for Trump in 2024 whether they identify as a MAGA Republican or not, and then you split off those two groups, Trump's approval among MAGA Republicans has basically not shifted at all since election day, since inauguration. And again, this is as true on the economy as on immigration. There's this core of about half of his voters, so that's about 25% of the electorate, 20% of the population, who even a couple of weeks ago, post tariffs, post stock market crash, were saying they still very, very strongly approve of Trump. Whereas everyone else, whether they identify as Republican at all, but certainly not MAGA Republicans, we've seen these steady declines in approval in terms of overall approval on the economy, on inflation, prices, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's the more extreme, the more MAGA Trump is, and that certainly seems to be the case this time relative to what it was 4 years ago, or 8 years ago even. The more we're going to start to see that group of non-MAGA Trump voters start slipping away.
Obviously, the United States doesn't have a parliamentary system, so what happened to Liz Truss can't happen here in the United States. But how did that all play out? What had to happen in order for the government to totally change course after sort of boldly, strongly staking out new economic territory?
Yeah, look, I think this really was one of those cases where the markets, the much talked about bond vigilantes, were what did for Truss in the end. Things looked pretty similar to what they do at the moment. You had this combination of stock market getting worse, the currency getting weaker, bond prices going up, a trio of things which don't usually go together. They often work in opposite ways. You had all of that going on at once. You had this immediately bleeding into a potential pension fund crisis in the UK, which again would have affected millions. And of course, this was all happening like it is in the US to the company that was traditionally seen as the party of finance, of economics, of the market. So you had, much like we've seen with Trump, all of the people who were, I think, experiencing these impacts most acutely had direct lines to the Prime Minister and to her party. So I think you were hearing from the ministers around her, from local members of parliament, were getting so many calls from their constituents, from local businesses, from people working in finance, telling them that, this was just absolutely unacceptable. You had enormous hits to consumer confidence, enormous hit to support in the polls. And I think the difference, one of the differences that perhaps made the political response even sharper over here was that we're just a less polarized country in the UK. Now, there is still some political polarization here, but a lot has been said about the fact that the US House, the Republicans in the US House so far, and in the Senate, by and large, have just been falling in line with what Trump is doing. Now, that is, of course, what happens when you have a super polarized political space. It really becomes sort of red versus blue. In the UK, there's still the ability for voters and governments. They feel more comfortable in dissenting when something gets quite this bad. So I think that just allowed the system to respond in a way that it wouldn't in the US. And we also had the added thing of there was an election coming up in a couple of years. We always have poll watching in the UK, just like you do in the US. So Conservative Party officials, members, ministers, again, would have been looking at this and thinking, we have absolutely no chance when the election comes around, based on what people are thinking at the moment. So the Conservative Party is famous for being quite cutthroat and doing what it needs to do to win. Now, I think people will be aware at this point that they very much did not win in the end. But there was just this sense that their chances were taking a massive hit if they stuck with Truss. The economic impact was enormous. This was not going to turn around. If anything, it was going to keep getting worse. Couple all that with the fact that there's less polarization, therefore people feel more willing to dissent towards their own party, their own leaders. The fact that Truss was a very new leader, so perhaps the loyalties were relatively weak. And then, that is essentially, I think, what allows a system like this to spring into action.
I want to talk about some broader trends that touch on this moment, but aren't necessarily specific to it. One of your many charts that went viral over the past year was how incumbent parties performed in 2024 compared with decades past. And it was historically poor. Basically, whoever the bums are, throw them out, right, left, center, whatever. Do you see that changing at all? Are we still in a fiercely anti-incumbent era?
Oh, another excellent question. I think inflation was an enormous part of that. There's been loads of research done that shows that there's something particularly salient about inflation that makes it even more the case than a standard recession. So if you think about recession, everyone knows things are bad, but certain groups of society are directly impacted more than others, right? So unemployment affects the people who lose their jobs. It doesn't directly affect everyone else. Inflation affects everyone. So in the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, which often gets talked about these days, the peak inflation was the first time, I think pretty much on record, that high earning Americans and low income and low earning Americans were equally down on the economy. You didn't get that in 2008, 2009. You did get it during peak inflation. So I think just the impact, the ability of inflation to cut through partisanship, to cut through socioeconomic status and just really sort of burn everyone, I think is really remarkable. So with inflation having eased over the last year or two, I think that will be less true of 2025. But there's then the question of were there other sort of big structural issues which contributed to that statistic last year, which are still around? And so they might be things like immigration. Immigration, again, was at exceptionally high levels in many, many, many countries over the last couple of years. This was very, very true of the US. It was also true of the UK. There's slightly different reasons there. The US was more undocumented crossings. The UK was a liberalisation of the rules under Boris Johnson. The Ukraine-Russia situation led to increased flows in various other countries. So that, again, I think was a big part of things, which, again, to an extent, I think will actually end up looking like a one-time shock. It's not that immigration is disappearing by any stretch of the imagination, but the flows that we saw in like 2023, 24, I think might be high watermarks in a lot of places. The other one is whether the increasing fragmentation of the media environment, the rise of social media with its emphasis on not emphasis on, but its social media is more favorable, I would say, to populist politics than conventional media. You're removing gatekeepers. You're allowing politicians to speak directly to the people. So again, if we think that is a factor in anti-incumbency, then that is certainly not going anywhere just now. So depending on how much weight one puts on each of those different factors, I think, it's still not going to be an incumbent-friendly environment right now, but some of the factors that were really biting hard in 2023-24, I think are probably easing a little bit.
Speaking to that populist, anti-incumbent vibe, one of the trends you've also tracked in the US and globally is views of how well democracy works and how important it is to have a democracy at all. And you've mostly found that younger generations are less confident in the necessity of democracy. Is that a continued downward trend? Is there any reversal, perhaps similar to what we've seen on trade, that once Trump gets increasingly perceived as an aspiring authoritarian or whatnot, that people start to become more supportive of democracy or the like? Now, I'm just spitballing here. I don't know the data. But what are you seeing there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And again, I think it's probably a bit early to see whether there are already reversals going on. But there's also a whole question just here about just how to interpret this data. So this sometimes get written up as young people basically favoring authoritarianism, autocracy. And that's, you could technically interpret things that way, but I think the probably more meaningful interpretation of that is that this is young people saying they're just dissatisfied with how things are going writ large. So, housing affordability crises, reduced relative status in society compared to in the past for young people, various economic ways of measuring that. The general sense of the sort of conveyor belt having broken down, and of course, when all of these things in society are not going as well as you wanted them to, you're gonna answer questions like that negatively. You don't think the system of government is working well if everything around you doesn't seem to be working well, and that each person who gets voted in doesn't seem to be able to fix it. So I think I would look at this as a general dissatisfaction with how things are going, rather than young people saying we don't need elections, for example. But, having waffled on about that, in terms of your question about...
No, I think that's really important context, because
cool, yeah.
Data like this, data like acceptance of political violence, I think oftentimes gets quickly spouted off without being reflective on what it actually means.
Exactly, yeah. I think there's a temptation to write this up as young people are love autocrats, but I don't know if it's... I don't think that's what the data's showing. In terms of whether that could reverse, I certainly think... Well, I think it'll be quite country specific. So I think dissatisfaction with the system writ large, I don't think that looks likely to go anywhere until conditions change. Now, conditions can change in two ways. You can have what Trump is doing right now, where maybe a lot of people look at this and say this sort of pseudo authoritarian leader who seems to just be riding roughshod over the law, ignoring unanimous Supreme Court decisions, that kind of thing. Now, if people decide that looks pretty bad, then I suspect you would see both the genuine underlying desire and responses to survey questions like that reverse, and you'd see more support for democracy, open elections, that kind of thing. The other way things can change is, if some of these big issues we've been talking about, whether these affect young people or people more broadly, the state of infrastructure, the sense of the extent to which the sort of conveyor belt of social mobility is still working. If some of these things change, again, I think that might manifest itself in an increasing support for democracy. But I guess that's all a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, I would interpret these questions as, are people happy with the way capital T things are going? And, there are all sorts of things that can impact that, but that is, I think, what people are answering when they answer those questions.
On the topic of the youth, which is an evergreen topic, I sent you the Yale youth poll that recently came out because there was a little bit of controversy over one of the results. And on this podcast, we historically like to do a segment called Good or Bad Use of Polling. I think we're now calling it GDBD needy, which is good data, bad data, not data. I think this is clearly data, but I'm curious for your take on whether it's good or bad. I'm going to read a quote from the Yale Youth Poll write-up. They said, when we asked whether they would vote for the Democratic or Republican candidate in the 2026 congressional elections, this is people under the age of 30 in their district, voters aged 22 to 29 favored the Democratic candidate by a margin of 6.5 points. But voters aged 18 to 21, so the youngest people in this poll, favored the Republican by a margin of 12 points. So this got people talking about whether there really is a divide amongst Gen Z, of older Gen Z being maybe more liberal like millennials, and younger Gen Z being truly more Republican leaning, or if this is too small of a sample, or if the poll is, when people don't like the results of a poll, they can come up with all sort of motivated reasoning responses for why this data shouldn't be considered seriously. What's your take on it?
I look at polls, especially of young people, as I'm sort of putting blurry glasses on almost when I look at them in terms of
drunk goggles. So for college age poll respondents, you just put on drunk goggles when you look at the data.
I drink a few shots of tequila before looking at polls of young people. It's just a thing I do. It's weird, but yeah.
No. Although, as you've tracked, I think young people are like having less fun and partying less. But we can get into that in a second.
Indeed, but yeah, polls of young people. There's all sorts of research showing that the error margins here should be thought of as being especially wide, right? So there's been work done by Pew Research showing that the reliability, in particular, of online opt-in samples of young people is not brilliant. And that's not even necessarily because we think young people are answering questions disingenuously, but it may even be that people who aren't even young are answering questions and ticking the box saying they're young. So with online opt-ins, I think that can be an issue.
Wait, like what's that 21 Jump Street, or what's the movie where like the old people go undercover as students in a high school to like bust up a drug ring or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah, there may be some of this going on, or even I think some research has shown that people outside the US are finding ways to get into these panels. So I think it's just generally good advice, whether we're talking about this poll or other polls, to be a little bit more skeptical of polls of the youngest voters or youngest people than of other ages. But the way I look at this is I think when we start doing fine-grained, and in this case it feels somewhat arbitrary, age cutoffs of, or what about if we cut between 21-year-olds and 22-year-olds, it feels it's getting a little bit sort of reading the tea leavesy. We're looking for things that aren't necessarily there. I try to keep sort of minimum samples, minimum cell sizes when I'm doing my own cross-tab diving, as it were, for that reason. So, the fact that we're slicing an already small bit of data into two, the fact that other surveys like the Cooperative Election Study don't seem to pick this up, the fact that there are all sorts of polls going around at the moment that show slightly different things for young people. All of those would lead me to say that, basically maybe this is real, maybe it's not, but I'd want to see the same thing show up in several polls and in larger polls and in stuff done by the likes of Pew Research, I think, before I would say this seems like a real thing.
Do you think there is a coherent story to be told about the politics of young people?
I almost think this is the problem, that there are so many coherent stories to be told these days. It's like we've got this sort of choose your own adventure space. Like one of my big sort of philosophical things that goes through my head at the moment a lot is that, it's right to think about misinformation and disinformation. But the bigger problem almost is that there's so much information out there now, from random accounts on social media to organizations like Pew Research and the Census Bureau, etc., that you can find something that kind of fits any story. So I've seen totally plausible stories told about how, like, right? Maybe what we're seeing here is that people who grew up, really sort of came of age during COVID, they lived through lockdowns, they couldn't socialize as much as they wanted to, they turned 18 under like a historically unpopular president in Biden. Therefore, this sort of micro cohort could be more supportive of Trump and the Republicans than those that came before them. And again, that all makes sense. It follows. But equally, it could be the case that there just isn't a dividing line between 21-year-olds and 22-year-olds, and that this is all quite fuzzy and people don't necessarily translate growing up with lockdowns into supporting Trump. So, yeah, I think it's plausible, but I think it's, and I'm someone who has written a lot about the differences between Gen Z and millennials and that kind of thing. And I've had, I think, reasonable pushback from people saying that even when we're talking about big sort of 20-year wide generations, that this can get a little bit flimsy. And I think once you get down to 18 to 21-year-olds versus 22 to 29-year-olds or whatever it was here, there's just even more of a case of that going on.
Well, isn't one of the main differences that you've written about between millennials and Gen Z, and between American Gen Z and European Gen Z, is that American Gen Zers are doing well financially? Whereas at this, you don't have to tell me I was peak millennial, born in 1990. Nobody could find a job when I graduated from college. Whereas people who came of age during the hiring spree, like the post-COVID hiring spree, or even the years before that, during Trump's first term, did not have nearly as hard of a job finding a job. And maybe that changes people's politics as well, from being, I think people view millennials, maybe perhaps the embodiment of the liberal millennial, as like AOC, who is inspired by Bernie Sanders and maybe came of age during the Occupy Wall Street movement and that kind of stuff. Obviously, that wasn't there for Gen Z. Is that a reason to be politically different?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. So yeah, I did a piece a couple months back where one of the metrics I was using was like the direct social mobility or economic mobility between generations. So to what extent are people who were born in one year doing better than their parents? And that basically bottomed out in about 1987, like late 80s, basically, which again is sort of peak millennial territory. So objectively, financially, economically speaking, prime millennial was the point at which you could look around you and genuinely have evidence that the conveyor belt was at the slowest it had ever been, the economic conveyor belt. So if it were a case of material economic circumstances relative to those who come before you or relative to your expectations are what dictate how one feels and how one votes, then we would have expected we would expect all sorts of trends to have things sort of bottoming out with millennials and then reversing since then. But I just don't feel like this is what we're seeing in the data. And so on all sorts of charts of how young people feel, their life satisfaction, faith in institutions, trust, well-being, all of these things, young Americans do not look any happier than young Europeans on all of these things, despite the fact that the US economy has been doing much better up until the last couple of months.
I know, we're going to have to rewrite all of this.
Indeed. That young Americans have higher home ownership rates than most young Europeans, and American home ownership rates for young people have been edging upwards a little bit in the last few years. So this is one where I'm really torn on how much of this is economics and how much of it is something else. How much of it could be, again, the media environment, which favors certain narratives over other ones. Because something you'll see from time to time as well is if anyone is ever brave enough to show some data which shows the material circumstances of young people getting slightly better, even when that data is really, really watertight, they will get absolutely ripped apart on social media. So I think there is, while it's objectively true that on really fundamental indicators like home ownership rates, young people today are still doing significantly worse than they were in the past. Even on home ownership rates, if you point to the increase, you will get torn apart. So I think it feels like there are some deeper emotional...
People are addicted to pessimism.
Something like that, honestly. I think, and on the one hand, that is feels like quite a negative thing to say. But I guess the flip side of that is, if the winds, the sort of social winds, were to change, and there was some way of that things could be reframed in a way where it would become sort of popular and cool to talk about how well one was doing, with no actual change in underlying circumstances, then you can see how the needle would move the other way. So, yeah, I think the relationship between material economic circumstances and sort of self-assessed well-being and that kind of thing is actually not as clear for young people as one would imagine, and therefore for me it could move in ways that we don't expect.
Well, this now makes me embarrassed of the question that I wanted to close on, because it's a pretty pessimistic one, and it's that one of the things that you track, you might call social ills or phenomena. And it's things like loneliness, singledom, education gaps, literacy rates, life expectancy. And some of these I think maybe tie together, others maybe not. But what social trends that you study worry you the most?
Great question. So I am one of these people who I basically describe you could call it the smartphones theory of everything. So the idea that a lot of negative social trends we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years are related to, if not solely driven by, the rise of smartphones, digital, handheld digital media. But I'm at risk of scooping myself here. But a piece I would love to write, if the evidence is there, at some point in 2025 or 26, is that we'll
come back on the podcast and talk about it then, but definitely scoop yourself now as well.
Excellent. Well, it would be at peak screen time. So I feel like we're getting to the point now where there's been so much discussion about the negative impacts of too much screen time, especially small screen time, that I think we might start seeing that reverse. But you asked me for a negative thing, and I'll tell you why I think that's still part of this. The thing I worry about is that peak screen time might be unequally distributed, shall we say. So we might start seeing people, like more middle-class people, better educated people, and their children change their digital media habits, their smartphone habits, in ways that we don't see at the other end of the spectrum, or at least not as much. So one chart that sort of lives in my head rent-free at the moment is test scores at different points on the distribution in the US for teenagers. And there's actually not been much, if any, drop-off, even during COVID, for the people at the very top. But there's been massive drop-off for people at the very bottom. And you see similar things when you look at screen time. There has been a much bigger increase and much higher levels of screen time for people of lower socioeconomic status and their kids than for those at the other end of the spectrum. So I guess the thing that I would be concerned about is that absent any sort of more wide-ranging regulation, or I don't know about other ways that this could change, what we might see is this sort of screen time correction among one section of society, and no correction or even a further deterioration in the other side. And following from that, if one believes that smartphone screen time has negative effects, that could create a sort of new public health inequality in modern societies.
That's really fascinating. And I already said it, but I really hope you do come back on the podcast to talk about it if you end up doing that research. I also want to crib something that you just said, maybe for future podcasts, which is name a chart that lives in your head rent-free. I think that could be a great new segment. But we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me today, John.
Thank you so much for having me.
My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us. Also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.